Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And thank you for subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am 12 Kyle. Check this out. What I want to talk about is the 80s. More specifically, what I want to talk about is 80s stuff. Like we had stuff in the 80s. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. Um, and the 80s were a dope time. Like I always say, like, we didn't have a lot, but we had a lot, right? And sometimes it's good to kind of reminisce and remember where you came from and the stuff that you had. Like, we have so much stuff now to where it's like, it's really kind of overkill. I mean, when you think about you have the world at your fingertips right now, and that you're holding a cell phone in your hand, and that cell phone can access just about any type of information that you want, and you can have it at the push of a button, and you can have it relatively quickly. Like, if I wanted to know how much elephants weigh, I could just go to Google, type it up in Google, and I'd have the answer in 2 seconds. As opposed to in the 80s, I had to go to the library, get an encyclopedia and try to figure out how much an elephant weighs. Not that I really care or need to know how much an elephant weighs. I know elephants are heavy, but that's beside the point. But yeah, I gotta shout out my homie Baylor. BTG for President is the podcast. He talks sometimes about nostalgia and throwback stuff, and I know Baylor was born in 82. I was born in 72. So his view of the 80s and my view of the 80s are different. But Baylor, you gotta feel me on this one, man. We had some stuff in the 80s, and things are a lot different now. One of the things that we had in the 80s, cassette tapes. Cassette tapes were so dope. That's how you listen to your music. I mean, like if you had a record, that was cool. You had a record player, that was cool too. But most of us, we had cassette tapes. And so with the cassette tapes, if you bought the, let's just say, Run DMC tape, you had an A side and a B side. And A side might have 4 songs on it, and you'd play it, and it'd play until it got to the end of the tape. And then you'd have to stop the tape, eject it, take it out, flip it, put it in the B side, press play, and listen to the B side. And that might be 4 songs too. And that's how we listen to music. It's not even really fair at this point because now, there's no A sides, there's no B sides, there's no, as far as I know, I don't even know if cassette tapes are even being made nowadays, right? But the cassette tape was so dope because, one, if you wanted to get through a song and get to the next song, you would look on that tape deck and hit what you call the fast forward button. And it goes, and you move forward. But if there was something on the tape and somebody said something that you wanted to hear again, you'd hit the rewind button and it'd go backwards. And the cassette tapes were so dope, man. I mean, like, all of the first albums that I bought, most of them, I bought a few. I had a few records, but for the most part, all the stuff when I started buying my own music, it was tapes. When it came to NWA, I had the tape. When it came to Eazy-E, I had the tape. Great Adventures of Slick Rick, I had the tape. As nasty as they want to be, I had the tape. Shout out to Uncle Luke. But it wasn't until like the 90s when I got CDs. But before that, man, it was cassette tapes. And cassette tapes were everything. And then we kind of graduated from the cassette tape where you could purchase, your favorite artist or whatever like that, to the blank tape. Now, if you had a blank cassette tape, then what you could do is create your own tape. In essence, you were the DJ and you created your own mixtape, if you will. We used to call it the slow down, get the draws tape. Everybody had to get the draws tape. And on the get the draws tape, what you would do is you go to the radio, and every night, I don't care where you live, every night your local radio station would play something called The Quiet Storm. And when they played the music on The Quiet Storm, there would be slow jams. And what you would do is you would set your your cassette player to record the songs off the radio, and you would slowly but surely compile and make a tape. And it was like the greatest thing since sliced bread. And you had to make sure that you could record and not get anybody talking in it. But if you wanted to have, I don't know, Endless Love on your tape, you just wait till they played it on the radio, and you would have your tape deck set. What I mean by that is you press pause, then you press record and play at the same time. Now it's paused, and then once that song started playing, you hit pause, and it would just record off the radio. And that was so dope. That was so dope. Cassette players were everything. And then as technology advanced a little bit toward the back half of the 80s, you had the reversible cassette tapes. And those were even better because what I mean by that, remember how I explained side A and side B? Well, side A would play. If you let side A play until the end, with the reversible tape, you didn't even have to stop the tape and flip it over. It did it itself. And that was so dope. That was so dope, man. I miss cassette players. What else in the 80s? Oh, in the 80s, we had rotary phones. Novel concept, right? Rotary phones were different. Rotary phones were the phones where you'd have the base of the phone here, and you'd have to stick your hand inside the key of the phone, and you'd have to circle it around, and it'd go like this, and you keep doing it to dial. You had to basically circularly dial each number. It was annoying as hell, but I thought it was cool though. The thing that I found is that the more that I went like to my friend's house and stuff like that, a lot of people didn't have rotary phones. And I remember being at a cousin's house, and I was like, man, y'all don't have a rotary phone? And I don't think we called it a rotary phone. We called it something else. But anyway, I asked them why they didn't have a rotary phone. And they said something that made sense. They said, hey, man, if it's an emergency and I got to call 911, do you know how long it would take for me to do that? Got a point. Even though it's just 3 numbers, if you got to go zzz, 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 takes a long time to dial. And it also takes a long time to dial the number. So any number, because remember back then, you were dialing 7 numbers, physically dialing 7 numbers. So the rotary phones were different too. We had one, and then it got broken, and I don't think we ever got another one after that. But I always thought I'm one of the few people who liked rotary phones. A lot of people didn't like them, but I thought they were cool. When you think about 80s stuff, one thing that we had in the 80s were the Rolodex. The Rolodex was everything. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, what is a Rolodex? The Rolodex were these cards, and they came in this little circular pattern, and on the cards, they were, in essence, the first address book. So if let's say I met Eclectic, and I didn't know Eclectic. So I say, well, hey man, what's your number and your address? So he'd give me his name. I'd write it on the thing, John Eclectic. I'd put his phone number, 777 93 11, and then I'd write his address, Washington D.C. penthouse suite. You know he lives in a penthouse, um, and so forth and so on. And then like I get his, so I put his card in the Rolodex, and then I'd meet King Germ. I'd write King Germ, you know, uh, Germ Estates in Germantown, Florida. You know, because Germ got money like that, he got his own city. Um, and I put his card in the Rolodex. And what I'm saying is like that's how you would accumulate names and numbers and stuff like that, and they were all in alphabetical order. So that's how you kept up. It was literally and figuratively the first address book. Like now. I don't know how many of you keep addresses and stuff like that, but you have people's phone numbers in your cell phone because if we're being honest, nobody knows. I mean, how many cell phone numbers do you know that you can just recite off the top of your head? For me, it's probably like five. Like I know my mom's number off the top of my head. I don't. My brother and I talk like every day. I don't know my brother's number like that. I know my wife's and maybe a couple of my boys. That's it. So like I don't. We don't know numbers like that. Back in the day, you had to memorize somebody's number, and when you didn't have their number or you didn't have it memorized, you could go to your Rolodex. And the Rolodex was it came in handy for the players. I mean that's how you write the names down and put it in your little Rolodex, and you have your notes if you wanted to kind of remind you of who she was or what she could do or whatever the case was. I mean it was dope. And Rolodexes obviously are obsolete now at this point, but it was the first address book. I talked a little earlier about cassette tapes. One of the things that went along with the cassette tapes for our 80s stuff, the boom box. Listen, I I cannot stress enough how important it was to have a boom box, especially as a young man who was in middle school or high school. You had to have a boom box. I mean, like the bigger the better, the louder the better. I mean, everybody wanted to be like Radio Raheem from Do the Right Thing. Um, yeah, man, the boom box was everything. I mean, obviously, the boom box is where you played your cassette tape. But I just remember like my boys, we like I had a cassette tape player, but I didn't have a boom box until I got to like high school. Cause see, you could play your cassettes on a cassette tape player, or you could play them like in your Walkman. But if you had a boom box, a what we used to call ghetto blaster, the boom box, everybody could hear your music. So you get yourself some some D batteries, D motherfucking D. Um, get yourself some D batteries, and you take your boom box outside, and whatever you played, everybody had to hear it because the boom box was big and it was loud. And in a lot of ways, the boom box helped usher in a sound for hip hop because it was synonymous with the rap music that we were listening to. Because I mean, I'll be honest, you wasn't putting um, Ray Parker Jr. on in your boombox. You were gonna put Public Enemy, LL Cool J, Run DMC, Salt and Pepper, whomever, Boogie Down Productions. That's who was gonna be bumping in your boombox. Two Live Crew. Um, yeah, you weren't playing New Edition in the boombox. I'm sorry, you just weren't. Um, but the boombox was so essential in the 80s. Again, man, that's 80s stuff that was just so dope. What else? What else? Oh, in the 80s, we had cameras. More specifically, we had what we call the Polaroid camera. Now, nowadays we got cell phones, we take selfies, we take pictures of other people, we were able to shoot videos. How would you like it if you took a picture and the picture literally took 35 seconds to develop before you could see it? I could take a selfie right now and I could see myself in half a second. I could see what the picture that I took, what it looked like. That wasn't the case with Polaroids. With Polaroids, it was a picture. You take the picture, and then the film would actually come out of the camera, and you had to hold it in your hand. And what we would do was we'd wave it, because the more air that got on it, the clearer the picture would be. The picture would become clearer quicker, I should say. Man, that was a great time. That was a great time. The Polaroids. Now, here's the downside about Polaroids. It wasn't a whole bunch of retakes. You know how like you can take a selfie or take a picture and you're like, nah, I don't like the way that looks. Listen, once you took that Polaroid, that was it. Like there wasn't no let me do it again. So if your finger was over the screen when you were taking a picture, you just had a finger over the screen. And trust me, we had a bunch of pictures with fingers over the screens. If somebody's eyes were closed, damn it, their eyes were closed. If somebody was looking in the opposite direction, they were just looking in the opposite direction. Like there was no redos as far as pictures were concerned. But the Polaroids were dope, man. Again, 80s stuff, Baylor. 80s stuff. Man, that was an era, man. A great, great era. What else? Oh, a toy that was wildly popular in the 80s. The Rubik's Cube. When I tell you that the Rubik's Cube swept the nation and was the most popular thing in the world, it really was. It's kind of hard for me to describe what the Rubik's Cube was. It was a cube with these different colored pads, and you'd have to twist them up. And the premise was to one, twist them up and then be able to find the right combination to twist them back to where everything was squared out and the same colors. That was very frustrating. And we had people who got into contests to see who could figure out the Rubik's Cube the fastest, so forth and so on. Do yourself a favor. If you're not familiar with the Rubik's Cube, go to Google right now, Google Images, and just type in Rubik's Cube, RUBIK apostrophe SCUBE. Yeah, man, the Rubik's Cube was wow. It was different. It was something that was a challenge for most people because, it was the ultimate time waster. Much like we are with our cell phones now, where we waste time doing a whole bunch of stuff. The Rubik's Cube was just that, man. It was frustrating, and I finished one, and then I never tried it again. Like it was hard to do that one, but it was something that everybody wanted to do and everybody wanted to try, and everybody that I know had a Rubik's Cube. What else? Talked a little earlier about cassette tapes. I would be remiss if we're talking about the 80s and I don't mention the VHS tapes. Listen, VHS tapes were everything. VHS tapes were everything. To have a VHS player, that was the first time that we got a chance to record stuff off TV. So before there was a DVR, before there was TiVo, we had a VHS player and VHS tapes. And VHS tapes was big, thick tape, and you could save 3 or 4 hours on a tape. And for me, man, it was all about videos. I would record shows like Rap City, um, Yo MTV Raps, uh, and I would put them on tapes. And what was interesting was like I remember my aunt, she used to watch I think it was I think it was like Young and the Restless. So she would record Young and the Restless each day. And I remember one day, man, I just wanted to record some videos because what you wanted to do is you wanted to record the videos off Rap City because and Yo MTV Raps because you didn't know which videos were coming on each day. And it was music back then wasn't like how it is now where they show the same stuff over and over and over again. It's not like it wasn't like that back then. So if you saw, let's say, special eds, I got it made, you might see that video on Monday, right? And that video might not show back up on BET again for another 2 weeks. Just depends. So you had to record it whenever you could. And man, I made so many VHS tapes. And I remember my aunt, she would record the Young and the Restless. And one day I wanted to record Rap City and I didn't have all of my tapes were like done. Like I didn't have any tapes. And man, I took her tape, I took her Young and the Restless tape, and I recorded Rap City over it. And it was like, it's crazy because I meant to, after I recorded it, I meant to take the tape out and hide the tape so she couldn't find it. But I left it in the VHS player and the VCR. And I remember she came home and she was watching it later that night. And it was like this one scene where Victor Newman and Nikki were about to get into bed, and then LL pops, LL I'm bad comes on. And she's like, what the hell is this? And I mean, what could she say? I mean, I'd already recorded. I was like, I didn't know that was your tape. I was lying though. But yeah, man, VHS tapes were dope. They were really, really dope. On our cell phones now, and you know, we play games and stuff like that. But and back then we had, you know, video games. 80s stuff. When I think about the 80s, the first thing comes to mind, the Atari. More specifically for me, the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600, I've said before, is the greatest Christmas gift that I've ever received. The Atari was everything. And again, it didn't have the best graphics or anything like that, but it was a gaming system that we played over and over and over again. We played Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, Combat, Pitfall, Pole Position, just to name a few. I could go on and on. But the Atari, man, was everything. I never got a ColecoVision. But the Atari, man, that was my first gaming system. And I fell in love with video games after that. Like I was hooked. I was hooked. There was nothing else to do after that. What other 80s stuff? Oh, when you went to school, you had to have a trapper keeper. Man, listen, the trapper keeper was everything. When I tell you everything, the trapper keeper was basically this fly ass notebook. And all of the dope kids had a trapper keeper. If you couldn't afford one, I don't know what to tell you. But I had a trapper keeper, man. The trapper keeper, it had these little dividers in here so you could divide up your subjects. You had a subject you had a space for math, space for language arts, social studies, and science. And the trapper keeper was just dope, man. Like you had to have a trapper keeper. I don't know anybody that didn't have one. I mean, all the cool kids had a trapper keeper. If you weren't cool, you didn't have a trapper keeper. Again, that's 80s stuff, Baylor. Yeah, it's a little bit before your time, but listen, that's what we had in the 80s. We had trapper keepers. What else? Oh, there was another game that we used to play. I was a little bit too, I'm not gonna say I was too old, but it was a game that tested our knowledge and our speaking ability and our comprehension ability. It was called the Speak and Spell. and basically it would call out these words, and you had to call them back. And then as you went further and further along in the game, it would call out words, and you had to speak them back faster, and the game got faster and faster and faster, and it you had to try to figure out how many words you could spit back to them as they were spitting you. It was a real cool game. Now the faster it got and the further along it got, you get frustrated. But yeah, the speaking spell was dope. Speaking spell was dope. What other 80s stuff we had? Oh, the girls wore jellies. Nowadays you look outside and you see girls wearing, the younger girls, I should say, wearing Uggs, which I think is short for ugly, but that's another story for another day. But yeah, girls wore jellies. Jellies were these nice little shoes, and they were clear and they looked like jelly. Um, all of the cute girls in my school had jellies, all of them. Like, even this one girl, I'm not gonna say her name, but like her family couldn't afford jellies, so like she had like some knockoff jellies. And one of my boys said, "Damn, she got some peanut butters." Oh man, we were so bad. But yeah, jellies were cool. Any ladies listening, if you had some jellies, hit me up. Let me know. Um, what else? What else from the 80s stuff that we had? Oh yeah, we had the Game Boy. The Game Boy. Remember the Game Boy? The Game Boy was the first handheld game that I can remember. Like, for as much as we play games and stuff on our cell phones and stuff like that, the Game Boy, the Nintendo Game Boy, was the first video gaming system that you could hold in your hand. And an ultimate time waster. An ultimate time waster. Didn't have really great graphics now that I think about it, but it was a dope. It was dope, and they had dope games that come with it. Um, what else from the 80s? 80s stuff we had. Oh, come on, man. I would be remiss if I did not mention the big wheel. Listen, in the 80s, as little kids, we had big wheels. Like, all little boys had big wheels. And what a big wheel was like, it was almost like, I mean, you see it's the cover art. It's almost like your first tricycle, but it was like your first motorcycle, but it was one big wheel. And that wheel, you had to wheel it and turn it around and stuff like that and use it to kind of steer your way around. And like I said, if you're curious as to what one looks like, just look at the cover art for this particular episode. Um, but yeah, man, the big wheels were everything. We used to race our big wheels. Um, I know somebody used to put dirt in their big wheel to try to make them. He said it made his big wheel faster. I don't know how putting dirt in your big wheel would make it faster, but he equated dirt to gas, I guess. But yeah, man, I just had to get on here and talk about some of the 80s stuff, man. We had some really, really dope stuff. And again, technology obviously has changed so much, and now we have so much more. And there's just about everything that I mentioned has been replaced. But I still like to reminisce because the 80s were a dope time. And if we're being honest, there was some dope stuff that came out in the 80s. And I gave you quite a few. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for me. Thank you for checking out this edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Remember, the podcast drops every Thursday at midnight. Again, that's going to do it for me. I'm your boy 12 Kyle. I'll catch you guys next time. 5 G's.